So let's talk about some general modeling rules of thumb. You never want to re-enter the same input in different places. And the reason is you want your model to be dynamic. So if you just go back to even the simple example that I had here, where I had sort of brought in the WACC calculation, you never want to hard code WACC in one area and then hard code it in another area. Always reference the original calculation. Another one that is generally very bad practice, and you see it all the time by new incoming analysts. Do not embed numbers within formulas unless the number is fundamental to the formula, like 1 plus WACC or whatever. This is a real bad type of formula. Presumably the user here went from pre-tax income to net income. Rather than identifying a separate line item that's called tax expense, it just embedded an implicit 35% tax rate to get to net income. And of course that saves you a little bit of real estate, but what it saves you is definitely not worth the cost. Because the cost is, as soon as you hit enter, no one sees that there's an explicit 35% tax rate. Not all companies face that 35% tax rate. And so this is a real problem because it hides important drivers of your model, generally. So it's almost always the case you do not want to embed hard-coded numbers with formulas. Of course, the real exception is when the number is never going to change. If you're using, for example, 365 days in the period or whatever, and that's sort of fundamental part of the model, or you doing 1 plus a growth rate. These are real fundamental of the model. You can use the number 1. You can divide a cell by 1,000 if you're always going to do it. But something like this is egregiously bad. Now, another item that you don't see a lot of models doing, but I think it's really more for auditing purposes than anything else. Clearly identify balance sheet items as balances. So for example, inventory, end of period, is a much better row header than inventory. And many of you might be saying, okay, well, if it's already in the balance sheet, isn't that obvious? And the answer is, it is obvious, but when you're using supporting schedules like most models use, and you've got inventory sort of throughout the model, it's not that obvious. And it's much better to have an abundance of caution and having a row header that's just super clear than to having a person who's using your model get confused about whether this inventory is a year-over-year change in inventory or the beginning of period balance or the end of period balance. So clearly identify balance sheet items as balances and identify whether it's as of the end of the period, the beginning of the period, or an average, whatever the case may be. The next rule of thumb is calculate whenever possible. This is sort of similar to the prior rule of thumb, the prior slide where we were talking about never re-enter the same input twice. Basically, this is a user here that's put in historical balance sheet results, and rather than calculating total assets, they've just hard-coded it from the 10K. So the issue here is that you've broken the dynamic element of the model. If you had made a typo to cash and then you go and change cash, you would then actually, nothing changes here. And so, or I guess the rule of thumb is whenever you can calculate something, calculate it. It keeps the model dynamic. The next rule of thumb is to avoid unnecessarily long formulas. One of the things people get really excited about as they become better and better in Excel is that you can really create some complicated formulas to save yourself real estate and create the feeling that your model is doing a lot more work. The problem is nobody can audit long formulas. They become very hard to really understand, and so it's almost always better to break out formulas to sort of break it out into multiple cells. Excel doesn't charge you for using extra cells. And so it's much better to actually just break these things out because the model is designed to be audited. It's designed to be played with. And the reality of it is a lot of times there are mistakes in models. It's going to be very hard to find the mistake here. Auditing complicated formulas. So speaking of auditing, since you're building models that are going to be used and audited by others, we've already touched on this a little bit. You have some off-the-shelf auditing tools in Excel. Alt-TUT, we didn't mention it here, but there's something control left bracket. So let's look at a completed model. Let me actually fix this. So if I wanted to see what the dependent cell is here, I can use Excel's native control left bracket tool. And it tells me, oh, okay, this cell is being driven by these two items. It's a plug. So control left bracket will do that. With slightly more complicated formulas, it breaks down. It doesn't go across multiple worksheets. But this is actually a pretty cool way to quickly hit control left bracket and say, oh, okay, you know, that's this is where that cell came from. As you can see, I just even lost my place. It sort of jumps you around. So if I went to EBITDA, if I went to the DNA section and it's coming from 2 different cells, if I hit Control Left bracket, it highlights the 2 cells, but it only sort of takes you to the first one, and you have to scroll around to find the second one. So it gets the job done. It's definitely a useful one, but it's certainly not perfect. And so that's a tool to know. The other tool that's actually far lesser known, and let me go back to that complicated formula. This is native to Excel again. It has nothing to do with Boost. I've got a formula here that's basically trying to arrive, basically whatever the scenario that the user selects, and we're going to build this later. It pulls the right scenario for the various line items. So for gross profit as a percentage of sales, since I've said the base case is 37%, in the user selected base case, as opposed to say best case or weak case, the base case is 37%. How am I pulling that? I'm using an offset match combination. Well, what is this formula doing? What's the value of the match? If I wanted to just kind of just evaluate elements of a complicated formula, I can highlight entire elements by hitting F2, getting inside the cell, using the arrow keys, and then Control Shift left arrow key highlights the whole thing. And now if I hit F9, it'll tell me, oh, that whole formula is evaluating to 2. I have to hit Escape to get out, otherwise it'll actually replace the whole thing with the 2, so you got to be careful. And then let me highlight this. What is this evaluating to? I'm going to hit F9. 4. Got it. So now if I highlight the whole thing, it'll probably give me 6. This whole thing evaluates to, I'm going to hit F9, 6. It makes this offset function a lot easier to understand now. And so this is sort of an internal auditing tool that exists in Excel and is actually far less understood or known than some of the other auditing tools that exist in Excel. And I think it's extremely useful. The one thing to be careful about is when you hit that F9, if you hit Enter, you will replace that whole formula with the number 5. So you have to be very, very careful. You have to escape, never enter when you're auditing these cells. Okay, some additional rules of thumb. Generally avoid hiding rows. Excel allows you to actually hide data. And in fact, many of you have probably seen models where if I wanted to hide this, I can just click. I don't even know how to do this without the mouse because I never actually do it. I suppose one easy way to do this is, and I should mention, all of you that are using PCs have a right-click button where you don't actually have to right-click with the mouse. It's usually sitting to the sort of near your space bar. It looks like a picture of a drop-down menu with a little arrow on it. You can right-click and it'll sort of enable you to quickly access right-click options. Some of you don't have it, in which case you can sort of mimic that by hitting, I believe Shift F10 is a shortcut that everybody has using a PC to mimic that right-click button. Smaller laptops don't have that right-click button. And now I can click Hide, and you'll see it hit it. The problem with this is that nobody can see this. Like, in other words, you've got a massive model, you're just going to forget that there's data hidden. And that's really what's wrong with this. So I'm going to sort of unhide here. It's a good practice to really never do this. If you're going to have to hide data, so for example, let's say you've got some segment data here and you don't want to show it, you just want to show the consolidated data. At the very least, group. You can accomplish the same thing by grouping. That means you highlight the range that you want to hide, Shift Alt right arrow key, and then it puts a little minus sign there, and you can then group it. That way, at least when you scroll down, you've got a chance of remembering that it's there because there's a little plus sign. Okay? And then we've got shortcuts that sort of show you how to open this and close it and remove it. If this is something you're dealing with quite a lot, I'm going to get rid of this. So Shift Alt left arrow key will just get rid of the grouping altogether. Oh, there's a little note here that if you've inherited a model with a lot of hidden rows instead of group rows or columns, and you want to just quickly turn all of those into groupings instead of hiding, there's actually a shortcut where it just zaps through the whole workbook. Control Alt H. This is Boost only, and it'll sort of fix all the hidden stuff into groups. So let me show you what I mean. So if I've got this grouped, or sorry, no, I want this hidden. So I got this hidden, and all of a sudden, let's say I've got a lot of those. I just hit Control Alt H, and it just finds that and just converts it to a grouping. So that at least fixes that issue. Center across selection versus merge cell. So this is another thing you see in models quite a bit, where it's better to do center across selection when you're creating row headers than merging cells. And so if, for example, I wanted to do, so here's an example. Or actually, let's just go to a blank cell here. Let's say these are annual periods. And I wanted to sort of show that these are historical results. Historical. So I've got a couple of choices. If I want to make this sort of, and let me put a little border, and I want to sort of center this across, I could do what many models do, which is just merge, Alt-M to merge cells, click OK, and then I can center that. And it looks really nice. You've probably seen this in a lot of models. The problem with that is if you're using the keyboard, and let's say I want to sort of highlight this column. If I highlight a normal column, it's just Control Spacebar. But if I go to try to grab one of these columns, it doesn't work. It ends up grabbing the whole range because it sort of now looks at this as one range. That's a real problem in financial modeling. That's really not good, actually, because you can still get around it by using the mouse. You can still, but we don't want to be using the mouse. And when you're building financial models, you're going to be messing around with stuff a lot. You want to get rid of all these merges. There's a lot of models where they're just merge cells everywhere. And so you really can no longer use the keyboard to grab columns and rows. So let's do better. Instead, let's unmerge this. And let's just do something called center across selection. It accomplishes the same goal, but you see these cells are no longer merged. And if you're wondering, where is this actual text historicals? It's sitting in cell C1. Just you've highlighted that this is where you want it centered across, but understand that the cell data is actually still just in cell C1. This is a much better way. Now if you hit Control Spacebar, you don't have any problems. Don't daisy chain links. So if you've got a tax rate and that tax rate is being used across the board, if these formulas are like equals tax rate equals this tax rate equals this equals this equals this, that's not good. It just creates a less efficient sort of way to grab data. If you, instead of having all the data being pulled directly from the source assumption, making that it's very easy to audit. If you went on any cell that's pulling that data, you say, oh, it's coming from the source, and I can change the source and everything changes. This just makes it a little harder to audit. This is a much better approach. The only exception for that is when you're straight lining data across forecast periods. We're going to do that a lot when we're building our financial statement model. So we're actually going to deviate a little bit from this. When we sort of just straight line historical data, we will daisy chain. That's sort of the typical exception that you see across financial models. Footnotes and comments. The difference between footnotes and comments are footnotes are things that you literally just type in at the end of your model. So if at the end of the Apple model I wanted to say something like analysis assumes Apple will launch iPhone 6 on June of 2015. And that's critical to the assumption, whatever, I'm just making this up. Then that's something, and you want that to be printed as part of the print range, or you want to sort of create a little disclosure here that for revenue, that's the assumption. Let's go in here and we can sort of create this as a superscript, and then so that we can put that footnote down below as you just saw, right? That's a footnote. Footnotes are things that you want to show at the bottom of the model. They show up when the model is printed. You see here, this whatever something here excludes $50 million of restricted stock per Colgate's press release. Comments are for internal purposes. So this is something that you want your deal team or folks internally to see. If I wanted to say this revenue excludes something, I'm going to hit Shift F2. That's the shortcut to create a comment. Excludes card sales per Q4 press release. That's a comment that doesn't necessarily, and I'm going to hit escape twice to get out. That's a comment that doesn't show up on printing unless you explicitly want it to, but it doesn't by default show up. And you can always edit this, Shift F2 to get into edit in, to change it, whatever. Alt EAM to get rid of it. The other thing is you can always use the right-click button to go in here and to do whatever you want with the comments. So the right-click button that I just told you is also really useful for comments. Okay, so that's the difference. And in terms of sort of what rises to the level of being, baked into the model and printed out versus what's internal, that's always up to you.